This is TLV1.
Hi, thank you for tuning in to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Gilad Halpern, and this is a message to all our listeners in New York. Join me for a live recording of the podcast on Sunday, the 11th of June, at Hebrew Union College in Manhattan. I'll be speaking to Yale University historian Professor Timothy Snyder about his new book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. For more details, check out our website or the Tel Aviv Review Facebook page. Also, on Thursday, the 15th of June, Yeshiva University professor Jeffrey Gurok, the author of The Jews of Harlem, will be leading a walking tour of Jewish Harlem, especially for friends of the Tel Aviv Review. If you're interested in joining, please send me an email to gilad, G-I-L-A-D, at tlv1.fm. I look forward to seeing you all.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a lecturer in German language and literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is the author of a new book entitled Gershom Scholem, an Intellectual Biography, that was recently published in English by Chicago University Press. The book delves into the life and work of one of the most curious Jewish intellectuals of the early 20th century, a seminal scholar of Jewish mysticism, as well as an early yet unconventional Zionist. Dr. Amir Engel, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good morning, it's great being here.
So you write in your book that it seeks to shed new light on the, quote, Scholem Enigma. What do you mean by that? What is the Scholem Enigma?
Well, there are a lot of questions surrounding Gershom Scholem. Gershom Scholem was a Jewish Israel intellectual who grew up in Berlin around the turn of the century and was the founder of this field of academic study called Kabbalah studies, the field of the historical study of Jewish mysticism. And he was a curious fellow. He wrote an incredibly amount of works, essays, books, papers, and so forth. But some questions seem never to have been answered. Was he a philologist? Was he a religious man? Was he a Zionist? How does his Zionism coincide with his interest in Jewish mysticism? All these questions were somehow discussed, but never quite answered.
Mm-hmm. And what are your answers?
I have very few, very simple answers. No, that's not true, actually. What I tried to do is explain Gershom Scholem's life and stories through two stories. What I claimed in the book is that Scholem has told us two wonderful, fantastic stories that are worth our attention. The one story is a story he told us about his life, his personal life, growing up in Berlin around the turn of the century, doing Aliyah around 1923, and being part of the Zionist effort to kind of rebuild a Jewish nation in Palestine, Zion. And the second story he told us is a story of the history of the Kabbalah. And what I try to show in this book is not only are these stories interesting to follow, they're also intertwined. So we can show how his interest in Kabbalah and the history he told us about his Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism is very much part of his personal story.
This is really unusual and curious because Jewish mysticism, certainly at that time, was an entirely esoteric field of study. Yet, as you say, it seeped into his more contemporary thought and vice versa.
There are two things that are worth mentioning here. First of all, it was not such an esoteric thought or field of study as Gershom Scholem would like us to believe. Actually, there were quite a few scholars and people who were curious in the history of Jewish
even back then, in the 20s and 30s.
It never stopped being a topic of interest. So Scholem obviously had a vested interest in letting us know that everything that was done before him was nonsense. But
how special he is. Yeah.
Precisely. But this is not entirely true. This is not entirely the case. So that's worth mentioning. The second point is, I think many historians, and it's not so uncommon, look into history in order to solve their own problems, in a sense, to figure out their own position in the world, where they are, where they're going to, also personal, but not only personal as a society. And so history is a field that serves sometimes future-directed thinking. And Scholem looked into the history of Jewish mysticism and found there ways to describe his own kind of dilemmas, Zionist dilemmas, political dilemmas, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this is not completely unusual, but it is interesting. It is worth telling. It is worth reflecting
So
on.
how do you think? Well, first of all, let's talk about his really unconventional take on Zionism. He was champion of Jewish-Arab binationalism.
Correct.
In Israel-Palestine at the time. Of course, it was, as it is today, the province of a tiny intellectual elite, especially based in Jerusalem. How did he become involved in this kind of Zionism? What really were the stepping stones that shaped his Zionist worldview?
So what I tried to show in the book is that Scholem has at least three Zionisms, three phases in which he engages in Zionism and comes out with a different worldview. The first one is when he was growing up. He belonged to what is called the Generation 1914. So that is the generation of people who become of age, become 17, 18, 19, 20, around the beginning of the First World War. And this is, of course, an extremely dangerous moment to become an adult, especially if you grew up in Germany or in France or in England. He belongs to this generation, and he develops his first ideas about Zionism in this context. So Martin Buber and ideas about a Zionism which is completely spiritualistic. It's a spiritual endeavor. And then, after the end of the First World War, he actually does this wonderful thing called Aliyah, right? So he actually materializes his dream, and after talking for years about Zionism, he actually does the Zionist thing, and he comes to Palestine. And what he finds here is very, very, very different than what he hoped that he will find when he was still in Germany. So he hoped he would see some kind of Gemeinschaft, this kind of wonderful, egalitarian, free, anarchistic, Jewish, spiritual commonwealth.
Mm-hmm.
He found Jews, many of them of Eastern descent, so what is called in the German vocabulary Ostjude, who were busy buying up land, sometimes cheating their Arab neighbors, getting into trouble, fighting among themselves, fighting with the Arabs, fighting with the British government. This was very different than what he imagined. And very quickly found a small group of similarly minded, mostly German Jewish immigrants, like he was, that were interested, again, in this ideal of Gemeinschaft, the spiritual endeavor. And these group of people very quickly realized that in order to realize Palestine as a spiritual center for the Jewish people, they must find some common language with the Arab population.
So it didn't make him give up on Zionism?
Not at all. Not at all. He never gave up on Zionism. He never ever gave up on Zionism. Was he Zionist to the end, only that his idea of Zionism changed, right? So during the 1920s, he devoted himself to arguments and to kind of political action in this context of this small, tiny group called Brit Shalom, in English, Covenant of Peace. So he talked and tried to persuade people that the only solution for Zionism is a Arab-Jewish commonwealth in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully somehow under the auspices of the British Empire, but it's not quite clear. It's also worth mentioning that this was only a discussion group. So
they had absolutely no political power?
They had absolutely no political power. They
or
were
political
shunned,
program?
Or political program, and they actually have very little contact with Arabs.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so they were like maybe similar to what we have, small fringe left-wing groups that still operate that have actually no real-life connection with the people they talk about all the time. And
that was the idea of Zionism that he had until the end of his life?
Not at all. So this group, Brit Shalom, and the ideas that it kind of had received a fatal blow in 1929. Right, so 1929, we all know there were the riots that erupted all over Palestine and caused terrible upheaval, at least 2 massacres in Hebron and Tzfat. And the idea that peace with the Arab population is something within reach kind of faded away. So this was the first kind of blow. The second was, of course, the rise of Hitlerism, right? Nationalsozialistische Partei in Deutschland and Germany became strong and came into power in 1933. So Gershom Scholem was deeply involved personally involved in German politics and was deeply worried, of course, from what's going on. And the point here is that you can dream about a spiritual Gemeinschaft in Jerusalem, only as long as
Gemeinschaft is some sort of community,
correct,
right? Yeah.
correct. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, this is the kind of community.
We are an English language radio, not a German
Fair
language
enough.
radio.
Gemeinschaft, right. So this kind of spiritual community living, only as long as as most of the Jews are living safely outside of Israel. This is an elitist project, basically. So once the Jewish immigrant problem becomes a real problem, so you're aware of the fact that Jews must leave, for example, Germany, then what is the status of your dream of some kind of spiritual community? Scholem was aware of this, I think, and he realized that maybe this idea is not so
it made
viable.
him reconcile his positions with mainstream Zionism that was predominantly made of Ostjuden, the people he had looked down on.
Precisely. The worst case in point is, of course, Ben-Gurion, right? The Polish Jew who was a phenomenal advocate and a very successful politician. And Scholem is very much... not so happy about Ben-Gurionism, but he realizes that maybe this is doch, as the German would say, doch, the only possible solution. So he reconciles himself, and after the war, especially outside of Israel, he becomes a very much kind of mainstream Zionist figures, and when asked, on German TV or something, he's always very much, okay, sure, we know the Arabs and the problems are real and we should try to and so forth, but... this kind of position, which we hear till this day very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very, very common.
Sure. It has been said about Ostjuden that for them, the late 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by a journey westward towards political modernity, liberalism, democracy, etc. Whereas for German Jews, it was a journey eastward toward a rediscovery of the Jewish origins, of their original Gemeinschaft, as it were. So it seems to me like Gershom Scholem is really the poster boy of that journey.
That's very much what I thought when I started this project. I thought, here's Scholem, taking the ideals, like a Nietzschean worldview, puts it on top of this Jewish mysticism, which he discovers and becomes some kind of a romantic figure in Zion. The only problem, he's nothing of a romantic. This man was a bourgeois, a university professor, with all the stereotypes we can imagine. He was ordentlich, so he was very organized, and he was pünktlich, he was on time everywhere, and I heard terrible stories about being late to Gershom Scholem, right? So you wouldn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. So, sure, he had all these ideals, yet he was in his character very much bourgeois, very middle class. And so I think there's two very... small things worth saying is, first of all, I don't think this kind of Nietzschean fury really suited his personality. So he stayed at the library. He didn't go to, fight with the 101, with the Meir Zion. That wasn't his style. The second thing is he lost personally a lot through war and revolution, and he was quite wary. He was quite wary, he was quite aware of the dangers that involve, going out to war, doing revolution. He wasn't too happy about that.
So his engagement with the nascent Jewish nation was predominantly intellectual?
It was absolutely intellectual. Mm-hmm. It was almost 100%. He had only this very short period, which we just discussed, this Brit Shalom period, where he's kind of trying to actually do something. All the rest of his discussions are very intellectual, on a very spiritual level. One should say, though, he was strongly opposed to the First World War. So back in Germany in 1914, the entire Jewish youth movement was very much kind of excited to join the army of the Kaiser and, slaughter the French, and he wasn't. He was very wary, and he tried to warn against this kind of move.
So now let's move to his scholarly work about Jewish mysticism. What were the central tenets of his innovation? You said that it wasn't entirely original as he would like to present it, but still he is still considered by many, even his critics, as someone who is really pivotal to the field.
Sure. So really the answer must be made very academically, I'm sorry. You must put it into two. There are two answers to this question. One is, what is he known for today? What do people know him for? So this is one question, which has one answer. And the second question, is, what was his main achievement? And this is two different things, because he's known for, From Berlin to Jerusalem. That is probably his most well-known work. That is his
That's autobiography.
That is his autobiography. I think if you ask people who is Gershom Scholem, most will not know at all. Those who would know, most of them will say, well, From Berlin to Jerusalem. Isn't he the guy who, and he was friends with Walter Benjamin, and he came from Berlin to Jerusalem, and he, was a Zionist and so forth. So this is his most well-known piece. And then he has other pieces that kind of, in a very broad term, discuss the history of Jewish mysticism. So, for example, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, which was published now in Hebrew. A Hebrew translation was just published now about half a year ago or so, maybe a little more.
For the first time?
After
more than half a century.
Correct, yes. This was published originally in 1942.
Yeah, so more than 70 years.
Correct.
Yeah.
So these very broad, synthetic histories.
Synthetic how?
Synthetic, that is to say, he takes a lot of sources and just tells us a story that is something that a lay person could read relatively easy, or, So this is useful for people who are also not interested in this very small field called the history of Jewish mysticism.
So is that why people were so inclined to look at his own life and work as intertwined, because that was really the intellectual movement that he led, therefore he himself could not have escaped it?
This is what I've tried to do in the book. This is precisely that. To look at these two stories next to each other and to read his most well-known work. So to kind of answer the question, why is he so compelling for people outside his field? And then there's another question, which is important, is worth mentioning very quickly, and that is, what did he actually do? Right? And so if you look, there's a little booklet with a list of publication. He has hundreds of publications. The vast majority of publications are devoted to the history of Jewish mysticism, and this is for Fachspezialisten, so for people who are, that's what they do. They study day and night the history of Jewish mysticism. It's a very small field. It's very lively, it's very interesting, but belongs to a very small subgroup of Jewish historians. So within the Jewish historians, which is a small field, And there Scholem had a phenomenal impact because he, for example, cataloged the entire library. So every scholar who's interested in the so-called library of Jewish mysticism is bound to run into Scholem and into his decision about which book and which manuscript belongs where.
Okay, so what is it about him? If he wrote predominantly to his own community of Jewish scholars of Jewish mysticism, to Fachspezialisten, and his political activity was mainly intellectual, he was a German Jewish snob, nestled in his Rehavia apartment, talking in German to his peers, why does he still stand out? And that brings us to one of the two questions that you said require an answer. What is his legacy today?
So I think it's a good question. I think for me, this is what I started with. For me, the answer is Scholem told us two phenomenal stories about the history of Jewish people through Jewish mysticism and his own history from Berlin to Jerusalem. And each one of these stories is immensely complex and compelling, right? There's something about Jewish mysticism, or the continuation of Jewish mysticism from who knows when to our time, which requires attention, which calls us to ask, how are we connected to some kind of subterranean, esoteric way of thinking? In which way are we esoteric? This is an interesting question, and we hope to find an answer in Scholem. And the second question is that of 20th century Ashkenazi Judaism, right? From Berlin to Jerusalem, right? And I think what I found interesting in these two stories is that you can see through them some of the major preoccupation of Jewish intellectuals, Zionism, and your West European history. You can see it happening. You can see the breaking points and the problems and the questions. And we are told we're brought to think about these questions through Scholem's personal stories.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a few examples of how he himself does it? I mean, it shouldn't be taken for granted, this literary exercise of weaving so many stories together, especially his own field of specialty and his own life.
Well, he just to say he didn't do it.
No,
but
yeah.
It's kind of right. How does he do it? Well, First of all, I think his most famous work and most influential is the work he did on the history of Sabbatianism. So Sabbatianism is the movement of a group of people who followed the messianic call of Shabtai Tzvi. This happens in late 17th century. There is a movement, there is an excitement here, the Messiah is here. And Scholem makes a very fascinating argument, which I think is the kind of a basis of a wonderful story. I'll try to recount it quickly. Until Scholem, the basic argument was that there was this guy, his name was Shabtai Tzvi. He said he was a Messiah. For some strange reason, a lot of people believed that he was the Messiah. They all got excited. They sold their stuff. They moved out of their houses. They waited. And then once the Ottoman Sultan hears about this new Jewish king, he invites Shabtai Tzvi to come, and he tells him that he can either convert or be killed.
Convert to Islam.
Convert to Islam, whereby proclaiming the end of the messianic, the Jewish messianic project, right? Because if the Messiah is a Muslim, that doesn't quite work for Jews. So this is a story, and this is where it starts, and this is where it ends. And Scholem says differently. The story begins with the conversion of the Messiah. So Shabtai Tzvi was afraid of dying, and he converted. And Scholem says this is a fantastic part of the story, because the real story of Sabbatianism starts with the conversion of the Messiah. How does it start? By people asking themselves the question, how could the Messiah do this act? It must have a profound meaning, right? It must mean something. It can't just happen that people with such great promise would do such terrible things. It is similar, but it's similar to the discussion around, if I may, Barack Obama, right? So there is all this excitement about this one character. He's charismatic.
Is he the Messiah?
Is he the Messiah? Can he bring, and then he's, well, how should we say, not quite. And then people start saying, well, we have to interpret. So some people get disappointed and just say, leave the project completely. But some people say, no, we can explain this. It's clear. He's trying to do it in order to, this is really a kind of a sting. And this is the interpretation that Scholem shows that is relevant to the Sabbatian movement. Sabbatians started believing in the project of the Messiah once he converts. This is a project. This is part of the Messianic project. Conversion is part of the Messianic project.
Because Sabbatianism outlived Shabtai Tzvi.
200 years.
Yeah.
And this is the great discovery of Gershom Scholem. So he tells us a story about a subterranean interpretation, a wild, unreasonable way of people to behave and to think and to believe and imagine. And let me give you just quickly another example of something like this. Say you have an imagination of what Zionism could be, or what Zion could be. You live in, say, Berlin, and you want to do Zionism. You're infatuated by the notion that Zion will solve all your problems and will be a place where everything that is wrong here will be right, will be rightened. And then you arrive to Zion, say to Jerusalem. Have you ever been to Jerusalem?
You're asking me? Well,
yes.
Yes. A few times.
Yes, there you go. It's not perfect, is it? I mean, it's nice, but perfect. I mean, there are traffic jams and there are people, and you're struck by the imperfectness of that dream you have. What do? There are two solutions.
I go to Tel Aviv.
You go. That's a normal solution.
Yeah.
But there's a small contingency of people who say, "Aha, this imperfection is a sign of its greatness."
Mm-hmm.
Right? This imperfection is precisely what we needed in order for us to prove, our zeal, our devotion to the cause. Mm-hmm. Right? It's another test.
Which, in a sense, is also what dictated his grappling with Zionism throughout the several stages that you described earlier. It sounds like, it was the same kind of...
So this is precisely what I try to discuss in one of the chapters. Scholem comes to Jerusalem and he's deeply disappointed, but he sees people believing in the messianic aim of Zionism. So they still believe, Zionism has to become messianic, and the fact that it falters here is just another test. It's another phase we have to strengthen our messianic zeal, and this makes Scholem very, very worried. And his clear, most immediate kind of ideological enemy is the revisionists, right? And one of their main Joseph Klausner. Joseph Klausner is a historian, and he wrote a lot about the history of the Messianic idea. And he argues the Messianic idea is something that exists. There is a Messianic idea, and Zionism must fulfill it. And Scholem is very scared. He's worried. He's like, no, that's not what Zionism needs to do. Zionism needs to figure out a way to negotiate with the Arabs. And it's a political solution. It's not going to be pretty. Nobody's going to be happy, but this is what we have to do. And so Scholem goes back to the history of Sabbatianism to show what happens when people believe in spite, right? Believe in spite of all other evidence showing them the contrary.
So he, unlike his contemporaries of the 1914 generation, certainly Walter Benjamin, his friend of yore, who was entirely pessimistic, it seems like Scholem was spared that omnipresent sentiment of his generation. Did he die an optimist?
Well, I think the right word to describe Scholem was pragmatist, right? That is to say, not quite an ideologue. So somebody who's willing to give up his ideology when the historical reality proves otherwise, when the historical reality seems to convey the message, no, this is not the right program. And this is what Scholem does, right? So he has this wonderful ideology, but then he's confronted with the reality. There is war in Europe. There is wars in Palestine, Israel.
So he died a pragmatic Zionist?
I would, yes.
A Ben-Gurionist? Yeah.
Well,
he still believed in that kind of Zionism.
Yeah, I would say Ben-Gurionist of En Brera. So somebody says, well, this is not quite... But it would be... There is one quote I love above all others in a letter Scholem wrote to Hannah Arendt. He says to her, sure, Ben-Gurion is a disaster. It's an Unglück. Right, but it's much, much better than what we'd have if we'd followed you, Hannah Arendt.
Right, which is probably a compliment in German.
I don't think he meant that. He meant that. He meant no. I really prefer Ben-Gurion to you because you're crazy, and Ben-Gurion is not what we wanted. But
yeah, again, sounds eerily familiar in Israel of 2017.
Yes, I'm afraid so.
All right, Dr. Amir Engel, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. You're a lecturer in German language and literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the author of the newly published book, Gershom Scholem, An Intellectual Biography. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast and many more where it came from, just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. My trusted co-host, Dali Shenlin, will be back with us shortly. Until then, check out the next episode of the Tel Aviv Review next week. See you then. Goodbye.